Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this LIDC event on reparations. My name is Shireen John, and before I hand over to LIDC's director, Professor Claire Heffernan, just a few words about the format for today's event. First of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us for this important discussion. As I said, we'll hand over shortly to Professor Heffernan. We are going to hear from all of the speakers in turn, and then there will be time for discussion. We did have a little bit of back and forth yesterday about how much time there was for discussion, but I'm delighted to say we have a fantastic panel, and I'm really grateful not only for them being here, but for them having been so cooperative and making it possible for us to allow more time than we had originally expected for questions. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. My colleagues, Natalia, Dinesh, will join me in keeping an eye and making sure that your questions get to Professor Farida Banda, who is from SOAS and is going to be moderating the event today. We are also encouraging people to live tweet. Our Twitter X handle is @LIDC_UK. So please do go ahead and live tweet. LIDC is a membership organization, so of course we encourage people to join us. We are formed of a number of higher education institutions in and around the Bloomsbury area, and also a number of NGOs. Membership is free for anyone in our member organizations, and if you're not in a member organization and you want to join us, please go to our website and find out how to do so. You will find all the links there. We do a number of events. We also do newsletters. We're very active on social media. We run training courses. We have a very important training course that we're very proud of in evaluation, which runs hybrid format in December. So there are a few spaces left on that if you're interested in evaluation. Again, go on our website, find out how to join us. If you are involved in news making, change making, blog writing, again, we'd be delighted to hear from you. As a Sierra Leonean Creole, I'm very invested in today's event. I'm going to leave it there because at this point, I'm going to invite our director, Professor Claire Heffernan, to come in and say a few words about why we're holding the event that we're holding today. Thank you for joining us. We're recording.
Thanks very much. And thanks to our wonderful panel and chair in advance. Here at LIDC, we are very cognizant as a research organization related to academic institutions that we work in global development, that we work in a very contested space. So we're very passionate about issues of social justice for our members, and today's event is part of our work in this area. So I just wanted to say, a big thank you and to introduce Professor Banda. We're very grateful for you chairing this session today. So just some brief background. Professor Banda is a professor of law at SOAS. She holds 2 law degrees from the University of Zimbabwe. She earned her doctorate at the University of Oxford as a Bate Fellow. She joined SOAS in 1996, where her work focuses on family law, human rights in the law, and gender issues. Welcome, Professor Banda.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everybody. We're really grateful that you could make it on a sunny day. And I'm really conscious of time, so we're going to crack straight on. And we have 4 fabulous panelists, and I think we should hear from them first. So we're going to start with Dr. Priya Luka, who is an economist at Leeds University. And she, as all the other panelists, have excellent biographies, which I encourage you to read as part of the advertisement for this event. So we're going to go straight to Dr. Luka.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banda, and thank you to the LIDC for organising today's event. So I'm a PhD candidate at Leeds University looking at colonialism and reparations, and I'm coming to this work as an economist, having worked on development and neoliberal policies and strategies for most of my career. So to open up into the discussion today, to kind of say why I've been thinking, particularly from my context, particularly as an economist in development, in looking at the strategies around poverty and inequality, why has reparations become so important in the work that I've been considering, and why this particular focus on holistic reparations? I mean, for me, I think that reparations offers a capability and a kind of way of understanding what's happening in the world today at a structural level. And to begin and say and kind of, say what we see across the world in so many contexts and understand it. We're seeing poverty levels at alarming levels. We're seeing inequalities across different contexts. We're seeing a climate emergency, particularly in particular geographies of the world. But we're also really aware that we're heading for complete despair and disaster on so many levels, with so much political instability as well. And we're also seeing within that context across the world, we're seeing the benefits of development being unevenly distributed across the world within and amongst countries. So in this context, what we do have so far in kind of the policy mechanisms that are there for reparations is the UN framework for reparations. And I'm going to start by mentioning this because in that framework, there is a big emphasis on self-transformation. So what is the agency of victimized and affected groups and communities where we know that we're in a context where elite mechanisms rule the world? And by that, I mean, particularly the economic governance mechanisms that set so many of the trade, tax, and debt rules in our current world are really concentrated in power dynamics that are not equitably available to all countries and to all communities and to all peoples. So the first thing I would say is that kind of context of self-transformation, self-repair is really fundamental, and self-repair for harm caused, and acknowledging where that harm has been caused and acknowledging that although it's historical, it continues as well. The second thing that I want to mention is that history has shown us that this is a tradition. The tradition of reparations is a tradition that comes from many Pan-African contexts, many Pan-African histories. And for that in itself, we have to acknowledge that reparations is not a new thing. There are examples right from the late 18th century. We've seen many reparationists work in the context of anti-colonial struggles on the African continent, particularly in the 1900s. And what we've seen in this context is that it was a real fight in many contexts towards the political powers. It was a political resistance to the entrenched power of the time. And the legacies of colonialism and slavery, as well as the ongoing systematic racism, continue to marginalize and deny entire groups and people their life opportunities in countries today, especially those in least developed countries. So I think those two contexts, like thinking about the UN framework and thinking about the rich history that this comes from, is really fundamental. And then where my work comes in is really to sort of think about what does this mean for economics and economic strategies and economic development? And I think for me, the beginning of kind of applying reparations and understanding them in their context means recognizing that we have extreme financial subordination between countries in the world, and we have a despairing economic coloniality. Now, when we think about the UN principles on reparations and the guidelines in the right to remedy and reparations, there are principles around restitution, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. And for me, it means these principles are really, really important for how we rethink or reimagine where we need to go with economic structures and economic development. So I think that for me, reparations enables a way of looking at the economic injustice processes and the harm that they cause. And it also offers much more than a kind of traditional expenditure-based approach to redistribution, which we've seen in charitable approaches, we've seen in aid, we've seen in development. But actually, what we have with reparations is a powerful diagnostic of how the world is undergrid by maintaining these divides. For example, the lack of sharing of patents for medicines and vaccines like the COVID-19 vaccine by powerful countries caused what we saw was a vaccine apartheid. The dominance of former colonized countries administering the application of rules that lead to inequity and the lack of power for people and communities to exercise a right to their future. So I would argue that nowhere is this neocolonial power that continues more evident than when we think about how the global economy came to be the way it is, And actually the global rules for macroeconomic policy continue to be made in these elite mechanisms where countries are the recipient of decisions made about them rather than actively trying to influence the policy direction of their countries. And this comes to the issue of sovereignty. So the economist Ndongo Silla talks about the lack of sovereignty that lies at the heart of the world economy. For me, then, remedy would mean that former colonized countries would have more control over how they develop and manage their mechanisms surrounding their economies. For example, opting out of pegging their currencies to the US dollar or the French franc, as we see in so many sub-Saharan countries where the French franc is particularly an oppressive structure, and being able to actually trade in their own currencies, being able to take on debt in their own currencies. It would also mean being able to question why countries are encouraged actually to take loans to develop their countries rather than designing alternative policy proposals around developing fairer taxing rights so that multinationals operating in their countries pay their fair share of tax and contribute to a much needed government revenue for public spending. So it's a structural analysis. It's looking at all parts of the economy. It's looking at all kind of policies. And it's kind of an examination of kind of where do we see these structures? Why have these structures evolved in the way that they are? Then what do we do to reconstruct the world through the economy and its institutions? And there are many campaigning organizations, many movements there in South communities that are calling for reparations. For example, the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development is calling for a form of debt cancellation for all countries currently facing a climate crisis and no further debt-creating finance to support development needs. So you see the articulation of reparations very much there in many movements. I would not say that it is, no longer a marginal issue or an issue that was, perhaps 5 years ago seen as kind of very radical kind of perspective. It's definitely influencing into mainstream policies, but it still requires so much in terms of understanding, public education. But I think I would end just on saying that the work that I'm trying to do in kind of apply reparations understandings into economic policy is really with a hope that it is capable of unsettling economic orthodoxies and providing, an opportunity for dissenting ideas in our collective struggles to find those alternatives that are so necessary, so needed as the world faces so many stark realities of inequality to this kind of broader neoliberal paradigm. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Loka. Next, we have Joseph Harker, who is the co-lead of the Guardian's Legacy of Enslavement project, and he's also the senior editor of diversity and development at the Guardian.
Thanks very much, Farida, and thanks for inviting me to this session, and it's great to be part of this panel of such expert voices. I came to this, I'm not a specialist in reparations, but I came to this when the Guardian started looking into its own history. 2 years ago, we had the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, and then the toppling of the Edward Colston statue. And that's the point at which people started thinking back into the movement changed from being just purely about modern day racism into looking at racism of the past and slavery, and how why it is that we put people at such brutal enslavers such as Colston on a statue, and why we keep them there to the modern day. And questions then started being asked about the Guardian and its own history, and whether a Guardian was founded in Manchester in 1821. And people were asking about the possible cotton connections. So we started looking into this. We brought in researchers from the University of Nottingham, then the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull. And they looked into the Guardian founders, and they found that John Edward Taylor, the Guardian founder, and 9 of his 11 backers, all 9 that they could actually trace, all had connections to the cotton trade, which basically meant they were trading in the profiteering from products made through slavery. And so once that became apparent, we at the Guardian just realized we needed to acknowledge this. We needed to do something which, at the moment, we needed to do something. It wouldn't be enough for us just simply to say this is what we found and this is a bad thing. We felt we needed to do something to match that, something to atone for what we discovered, because fundamentally the Guardian now has a new origin story. It used to think of itself as just being purely founded by a liberal progressive in the 19th century Manchester, and now we know that we were founded off the profits of slavery, and that's quite a fundamental thing, especially for a liberal organization like us to face up to. So but we looked into the research. We said, first of all, we want everything out there. We want, once we'd found the first part of the first discovery, we asked our lead researcher, Dr. Cassandra Gupta of the University of Hull, to look into more aspects of the Guardian's history and look more into into the Guardian's founders, and to come up with, uncover everything that we possibly could do within the time that we had. We also decided that we wanted to do something to put it right, and that involves something, things such as new reporter roles and embarking on a plan of 12 new reporters who'll be covering different parts of the world in the US, race and equity reporters in the US, Caribbean correspondents, South America correspondents, 2 community affairs correspondents in the UK, and 2 extra correspondents across the continent of Africa to supplement the correspondents who we already have. We're also starting out on a restorative justice program, looking specifically at the descendant communities of the places where the Guardian founders made their money. One of the Guardian founders actually owned a plantation in Jamaica, and so we're doing some work in Jamaica. But the other founders, through cotton, made their profits through the southern United States. And one invoice we found in particular came from the Sea Islands off the coast of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, where we know that the Guardian founder actually bought cotton through in the 1800s from these plantations. So we wanted to do something which led there and did something to try and repair the injustice in that region too, as well as looking at Manchester and as well as looking at Africa to some extent. And we may still find more connections potentially with Brazil, and if we do find that, then we'll move to doing some reparative work there too. So it was very much, we're also doing more about creating more opportunities for journalists of the future by having bursaries and fellowships. We're committed to do more research and to also telling the story to a wider audience than just the Guardian. So we're looking to partner with museums and potentially have conferences and exhibitions to try and to try and tell more people about the story, because it's not just a story of the Guardian. The Guardian's the 11 people, the 12 people in total who founded the Guardian were just typical Manchester businessmen of the age. Almost all Manchester businessmen at that time would have made their money through cotton. Manchester, the city, grew from being a small village through this thriving, bustling, booming metropolis through almost entirely through the profits of cotton that related to cotton. So it's a story of the Guardian, it's a story of Manchester, it's a story of the UK, and basically coming to terms with this story, which many people are not aware of, and trying to tell it to a bigger audience so that the policies, that Priya set out of reparative justice can actually be more broadly accepted and be understood by more of the population, as to why we're doing these things, why we need to do this. And I think another aspect of this is also that it's not a 200-year-old story. The Guardian was trading in, the Manchester cotton merchants were trading and making their money through United States grown cotton right until the late 19th century. And also the descendants of those and the inequalities that were embedded at the end of slavery and of the slavery era are very much still with us. The demonization, the subjugation of Black people across the planet is very much was set in motion by the centuries of slavery and dehumanization that we went through, for which there was no reckoning, for which there was no compensation, for which there was no restorative justice. So although the individuals who were enslaved have since passed on, the legacies of slavery are still very much with us, and that's a story that we are hoping to tell to a wider audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Joseph. I was so carried away by Priya earlier. I almost forgot to I forgot your name. It's also exciting. So I've looked up, I've made sure I've checked up again on Onyekachi Wambu, so I wouldn't get too carried away. And he, like Joseph, is a journalist, but he's also written about the Windrush generation, and now is working as the Director of Special Projects at AFID, which is a diasporic organization that links up the African diaspora with people on the continent. Over to you.
I think I was muted. Thank you, Frida. And thanks for that introduction. I, like Joe, I came to this in a very strange way. I was reading a book of a theatre play by the playwright August Wilson, who embarked on a mission to take to tell the story of African Americans through the 20th century. And on this cusp of the 19th and 20th century, one of the plays that he did was called Joe Turner's Come and Gone, and it was dealing with the individuals who a generation, a couple of 15, 20 years earlier, were still living with the consequences of enslavement and who had just been recently freed. And they were trying to reunite with members of their families that were on different plantations. And it was a harrowing story. And you really began to think about what enslavement was like. Following the proclamation of emancipation, they were frequently sent out into the world with no resources. And they had to make a life. They were at one point promised 40 acres and a mule, and we know the betrayals that happened after that. But on the whole, they were kind of sent out with no resources to go and make a world. And in the play, one of the characters who's looking for his partner, his wife, and has a daughter, and they want to reunite, has a vision. He's on the verge of a breakdown, and he has a vision where he sees these skeletons walking out of the Atlantic Ocean, and millions of them, and they walk onto the eastern seaboard of the Americas, and then they take on flesh and begin to breathe. And it was very strange because intellectually, we learned the story of the Mystical Passage, we learned everything else, and we'd accepted that people died. But it was the first time that emotionally, through that reading that play, that I understood that the Atlantic Ocean was an African graveyard, and there were millions and millions of people. I mean, the most conservative estimate is 2 million. Others estimate higher, 20 million, and then you consider people who died as a result of being captured. You think about the people who died on the plantations, and then you think about this enormous catastrophe and that befell the African world. And then I looked around and said, well, how has this been acknowledged? Who has put up a statue to any of these victims? Who talks about them? Who talks about the impact on their descendants? Where's the discourse around all of this? And then you look around, and actually, the statues are to the Colstons and others who Colston personally, we know in terms of the trafficking of Africans, is responsible for probably 18,000 deaths. And you're like, well, why is he on a plinth? So, in the late 80s, I began to be haunted by them bones, and around that time, early 90s, the African Union starts talking about reparations. Bernie Grant, who attended the African Union conference in Abuja and Lagos, comes back and establishes the African reparations movement, and we start looking at what happened to these people. Why had we as Africans not actually talked about this enormous catastrophe that has befallen us. What were the, this word reparatory justice is in the air, but what were the mechanisms for reparatory justice? So a campaign began, which I was involved in, and Bernie Grant led. I started a Remembrance Day in 1995 to remember the victims. Nobody else in the country or anywhere else in the West were in the UK certainly was doing that, and you're thinking, well, how did up to 20 million people or more leave the earth and there's nothing to acknowledge them? And that Remembrance Day and some of the other different people were approaching that issue of reparatory justice from different angles. There were people trying to return stuff from museums that had been looted as part of this exercise of terror and this exercise of exploitation. And there were others who wanted economic compensation, there were others who were looking at holistic kind of repair. So there are a lot of different approaches to this central issue of what happened to people of African descent during slavery, during colonization, and during that empire period. And then the question was, well, why weren't we talking about it? And why is it now that we're into a second phase? Because there was an earlier phase in the early 90s where people like myself started to do action. Why only now? And it seemed that there was something very interesting that was happening at the beginning of the 90s, which was actually, we had all been so focused on removing these symbols, or not just symbols, actual policies of exploitation in each of the different theaters in what I'm calling this African Atlantic world. So from Africa to the Americas, to the UK, civil rights campaigns, decolonization campaigns, etc. And what we were facing at the end of the 90s was the last major one, which was South Africa in 94. So you had an age of perhaps 400 years of African codified inferiority. South Africa was the last one. So anybody who tells you this is an old story is talking crap. There is, an age has ended, and as Africans, we're beginning to talk now about what happened during that age, the impact on our lives, the impact on survivors and their descendants. And this is a conversation that is not going to stop. And there is a conversation, part of that conversation is to seek relief and compensation. Part of that is about repair and having an internal dialogue. And part of that is also about getting the society around that can actually put statues on, if you go up Park Lane to animals in war and talk about them in heroic terms and be grateful for the role that they played, but had not until very recently found space to acknowledge the millions of people that died as a result of its interaction with people of African descent and the riches that were got as part of that. So let's have a grown-up conversation about this period in history. And we're talking about it because we are now looking back and we're learning more and more. Others like me are asking that question. I ask myself, how can all these millions disappear and nothing is talked about them? How can they be sent out into the world as they always were, with nothing? And then those who had injured them and terrorized them were always compensated. That compensation happened in the UK. We were only paying off the interest on the debt up to, I think, 2015. That compensation has happened in every theatre. The last one was in South Africa and Zimbabwe, where they were allowed to keep the land. And then the Africans are always sent out into the world to make themselves, and, you know, as my Nigerian friends say, to eat freedom. And we know you can't eat freedom, because freedom, the basis of real freedom is material. Oh, it's underpinned by materialism. So I'll stop there, and I hope we can have a conversation about how we need to move this on and actually address what happened during those 400 years. The roles all of us played. There were allies in the, you know, European world who were, you know, supported us in the campaigns, and we acknowledge them. But there was more wrong done, and we need to look at that and do the auditing and do the accounting, and then work out how we begin to repair, you know, that broken and terrorized African world.
Thank you very much, Onyekachi. I'm particularly grateful that you've raised the role of the arts and August Wilson in terms of, you know, raising awareness and also engaging people's emotions. Our last speaker is John Dower, who is describes himself as a director, tutor, and mentor. So he's actually working in films. But I think he connects very well to something that Joseph was saying, which is how The Guardian has been forced to rethink its origin story. And the reason why that we're all grateful that all the panelists are here, but that John was able to join us, is because he's part of the Trevelyan family. And so we always talk about the need for reparations, but what about those who have been the beneficiaries? And so it's important. And thank you very much, John, for joining us.
Thank you, Farida, and thank you, Shireen, for inviting me. And I'm very honoured to be here. Wow, I thought it was going to be quite a good thing to be last speaker. I could have a bit of time to collect my thoughts. And what's happened is that Priya, Joseph, and particularly Onyekachi have kind of completely made me feel kind of like I'm so late to the table that it's ridiculous. So thank you, Onyekachi, for raising those things, but I now feel somewhat humbled by what you've all been talking about. So I shall just tell you a brief story. In February 2023, 8 months ago, I stood in front of an audience in St. George's in Grenada. And along with my cousin, Laura Trevelyan, we read out the apology that the Trevelyan family had spent a pretty painstaking year putting together, and for our ancestors' actions in owning plantations on Grenada and receiving so-called compensation in 1833 in quite a large amount of money. And at that moment, without trying to be too histrionic, my life changed, because it wasn't just, I felt, a big moment for me. It was a moment that I've been waiting for 7 years since discovering this in 2016. I said I'm quite late to the conversation, and shamefully, the family only found out its links to transatlantic chattel slavery by looking at the UCL database, Legacies of Slavery database. So I was late to the conversation, but what struck me suddenly and very powerfully was, there I was standing in front of this audience of people making this apology, and yet to them, I think I was perceived as a representation of an enslaver. And though I had come in a humbling role to apologize and try and make amends, try and atone, to try and set forward a path to reparative justice in the small way that we were able to, I realized, and it dawned on me, that actually what I was a representative of the enslaver. And it was a very chilling moment for me and a very humbling one. And ever since then, I think I have realized that as a white middle class man, I stand on the backs of so many people, and it's a very uncomfortable position to be in, and I've realized that actually I'm just one of the lucky ones. And I think that was a very profound moment. And I think ever since then, it's been a real roller coaster and a real educational time since then that we have taken place. But let me just go back a little bit. So in 2016, we discovered that I discovered that the family had been involved in transatlantic slavery, which we had no indication of from our ancestors. I confronted the family. I said, we need to apologize for this. This is something that we can't ignore. This is just too big a crime against humanity. It was a very complicated and tortuous affair, but it was really, as Joseph has reminded us, the importance of and the terrible events around George Floyd's death in 2020 and the subsequent Black Lives Matter marches and the Colston statue going down, I think electrified us. We were all in the pandemic. We had a lot of time to think. And Laura, my cousin, who at that time was a BBC anchor in New York, made a documentary called Grenada Confronting the Past, which was then shown on the BBC. And that was the point at which the family all went, right, we need to do something about this. And so luckily I could bring them on board, and we began to convene meetings, which took a year, and we eventually had 104 signatures for our letter. So that's the process we went through. It was painstaking. One of the most significant moments that we had in our journey was that we were addressed by Sir Hilary Beckles, the vice chair of the University of the West Indies, and also the chair of the Reparations Commission for CARICOM. And he said, no one has apologized to the Grenadians for what your ancestors did. No one. So even though you think philosophically it's difficult to apologize for something you didn't do, which I think technically it is pretty difficult to do that, I think we felt very galvanized by that address. And I think we were persuaded that our apology was going to mean something. And boy, it certainly felt as though it did, because the response we got, I mean, it was very powerfully received. There was some protest. We had some pushback, but on the whole, I think people were very, what can I say? Grateful, but moved, but also I think they felt it was about bloody time. So that was the beginning of a kind of real change in my life. Since then, we have been involved in several Guardian articles and interviews. The Guardian, in fact, the Observer broke the story back in early February, and then since then we've been doing whatever we can to support the reparative justice movement, as well as setting up our own charity to try to administer the funds from the family to go towards Grenadian educational organizations, plus the diaspora over here, which we're still trying to set up. It's taking a long time to set the charity up. About 2 months after that, we set up Heirs of Slavery, Laura Irons, and 6 other family members who were descended from people who were involved in plantation slavery. And that's been a pressure group. It's sort of an advocacy group, a campaigning group. We're both supporting activists and reparations campaigners, but we're also trying to encourage other families and other descendants of the enslavers to come forward and recognize what they can do to try and make amends. And ultimately our aim as campaigners is to try and persuade institutions, the king, but particularly the government, because ultimately, as we know, the king won't do anything unless the government tell them to. So we really need to try and change Rishi Sunak's mind, as we've all heard. Rishi Sunak in government, in Parliament earlier this year, said that there was no need to unpick history. Well, in lots of ways, I think my answer, and this is something that Charlie Gladstone, who's one of the members of Heirs of Slavery, said so memorably to me. He said, it's not about unpicking history, it's about unpicking the present. You know, it's going back to what Joseph said about the fact that we have inherent and deep racism, which has gone on and was fueled by transatlantic slavery. And that's something that I think is markedly different between transatlantic chattel slavery and other forms of slavery from the past. So I think I'll stop talking, but essentially that's my message, that we are really We've been galvanized by what we discovered. We are very much humbled, and we are, as a family and as heirs of slavery, trying to do something about the amends for the terrible crimes that our ancestors committed.
Thank you very much, John. That's appreciated. And thank you to the panelists. That was absolutely fantastic. So we're open now for questions and for discussion. And our panelists have very kindly limited their presentations, which could have been longer, so that we would have time. So I will try and not take over. So if anybody has any questions, please start typing them, and Shireen will feed them through to me. I think, thank you very much, all of you, for your excellent presentations. In a way, you've answered one of my questions that I had earlier, which was, one of the books that really impacted me was Charles E. Mill's The Racial Contract. And at the beginning, in the epigraph, he has a quote which says, when African Americans speak of when white people speak of justice, they mean just us. And I think one of the things that you've all done is to engage what justice looks like from an economic point of view, Priya, and in terms of what The Guardian has done. But I thought I'd give you an opportunity to define justice in your own terms rather than Farida's interpretation of what you've just said. So who'd like to go first in terms of, does justice mean just us? And if so, who is us? What does justice look like in this framework of reparations?
Maybe I'll go first.
Thanks, Joseph.
It's a very interesting question that you pitch, and it's to me, it goes back to what John was just saying. You know, we need to do something, and what should that something be? And that's the thing that we've been sort of really, we thought long and hard about what we should do, and what can a medium-sized institution like The Guardian do. For John, it's what can a family do with their resources. And it's one of those, and when you look at what is justice, justice is a complete restructuring of the system, of the racial system. And as part of this project, I was last month went to the Sea Islands in the United States, in particular the coast along Charleston in South Carolina and Savannah. And it's so clear just how embedded the injustice that was there on the day that slavery ended in 1865 is still there. You know, the people who were enslaved got no compensation, they got no land, they got no wealth. This idea of 40 acres and a mule that was supposed to be owed to the enslaved never came to pass. And so when you don't have the land, when you don't have any means of making wealth, and you look down 150 years down the line, we are still, those inequalities are still embedded. The businesses, the restaurants, the shops, the everything is still basically white owned in those regions, and there's virtually no way for Black people to get into that sort of sense of wealth creation in a system which is still so racially divided. So there's something so big that needs to be done to really transform and to really provide justice. It in a way speaks to what Priya was saying earlier about, rethinking the economic model. But we are a long way from that in terms of what The Guardian can do, what the heirs of slavery can do. It's such a huge task that needs to be done. I guess all we are thinking at The Guardian is that in terms of, we have resources that we can put to helping people in those communities and those descendants who are particularly impacted by our founders, and helping them. And also in terms of the reporting that we're reporting on, we'll be the only British media organization to have a Caribbean correspondent, for example. So all those issues of the Caribbean, which are just not being reported on at the moment, we'll be having a correspondent who's covering the Black population of Brazil, which is a population of over 100 million, which is barely reported on by any Western news organizations. And so, and we'll also have a reporter who will be covering the Sea Islands region of the southern United States. So we would hope that by airing these issues, giving people a voice, listening to people, holding people in power to account, that we can do something to shift the dial on this. But it's a massive question, and it's so much needs to be done, and we're very aware that we can only do a small amount of what's necessary.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. We didn't expect you to carry the whole world on your shoulders, but thank you for getting a start on that. Any of the other panelists want to address that question? We've got another one waiting, so I'm happy. Onyekachi, did you?
I can come in on that. We've started. We're doing a 2-day. Afford is involved with the all-party parliamentary group on reparations, on African reparations, and we're hosting the first big UK reparations conference later this month on the 21st and 22nd of October at Friends House in Euston, where we hope we can begin to have that conversation about what does justice look like and invite all the different stakeholders who are involved to have the conversation. But for me, the question of justice, again, I think I looked at that trajectory of the 400 years and who was compensated. And for me, the biggest injustice, perhaps, that I would mention, rather than trying to define justice, is what happened to Haiti, which was the first country that actually begins the big quest for recovery of agency of freedom, and they win their rights to independence and freedom from slavery, and then have been punished. So the people who enslaved others were compensated, but the Haitians for over 100 years had to pay France for their freedom. And you look at West, the debt that all of us Africans in that African Atlantic space and others owe to Haiti, and then you look at the current condition of Haiti. I mean, Haiti is not special. There are other Caribbean countries run by Africans that have done well, but Haiti has been particularly punished. Next door to Haiti, you got Jamaica. They're poor, but Haiti is a special case, and that injustice, I think all of us need to deal with, as a really important intervention. How do we repair what has gone wrong in Haiti, and why have the West? Africans have helped define this freedom that the West always talks about, and that definition has been done on our backs. And when Haiti does it, it is punished, and we need to really look at what freedom means and how we repair that in Haiti.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both. Well, we've got questions starting to come through now. So the first one is from Iamede Thomas, and I'll give you two at a time. And so she's curated an exhibition at the Museum of London in the Docklands, and she asks a question, which is, why is it the focus of reparations and the countries that have been discussed are all out of Africa, whereas the people who were enslaved actually came from Africa? Why have African countries not actually been engaged in terms of reparations going that way? And the second question was from Luke Daniels, and he says that the government, I assume he means the British government, is refusing to meet CARICOM to talk about reparations. So what can be done to bring them to the table, to bring, I would imagine, the British government to the table, because CARICOM is willing to come to the table. And so I'll gather some more, and you, who would like to go with those? So we have two questions to start. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just in terms of the conversation about reparations for Africa, our family was very focused on the Caribbean for obvious reasons, and this is true of other families involved in heirs of slavery, because all of our ancestors were involved in trade with Caribbean islands. So our focus was initially there and with CARICOM. As soon as we came over and started talking to reparations groups, including Onyekachi in the UK, we realised that as I admit that we're late to this conversation, so we're learning and we're picking up fast. We learned that the conversation had been going for a long time here, and a lot of the focus was on, understandably, on Africa. So our role, I think, has always been to be here listening and supporting. And so I completely understand why there is this strong feeling that reparative justice for Africa is also really crucial. And some would say more important. I know that there are some who say it's more important than for the Caribbean. So there's a really live and important debate about that, and I completely understand it. Regarding why it's so difficult to get the government to talk to CARICOM, I mean, the government, I think, are terrified, and I suspect that they are increasingly worried about the pressure that's building. And I really hope that if Labour get in, that David Lammy, as Foreign Minister, I hope he will be, can push this forward, but I can't see it happening under the Conservatives. I mean, they feel like so far away from any reasonable behaviour that you just think, well, that's just not going to happen. But maybe I'm wrong.
Joseph?
Yeah, maybe I can just talk on that second point about the government. I'm maybe less optimistic than John is. I don't think a change of government is going to make any difference. I think the current Labour Party seems to be pitching itself to red wall voters and doesn't really care about black people particularly. So I don't have much and seems to be more interested in what the Sun and the Daily Mail will be thinking about anything than thinking about certainly about the black population and how they feel. But I do think that in a way what I was saying earlier is that, you know, we've done this. We've done an editorial project called Cotton Capital, which was edited by my colleague Maya Wolf Robinson. And that's a way in which we can speak to Guardian readers about what we're doing. But I think it's so important for us to go to beyond the Guardian readership, you know, so we are putting on, we want to do more events to talk to the people of Manchester, for example, to talk to wider groups, because it's clear that without this understanding of Britain's complete entanglement in slavery, how Britain grew out of slavery, after the profits of slavery are integral to the entire story of British economic success, the Industrial Revolution, that without people understanding how central slavery is to Britain's own story, then I can't see people making the political class, the government, feeling that it needs to be under any kind of pressure. So we are particularly keen to take this story. I mean, one example is you know, and the thing that maybe shocked me the most out of this whole thing was, the coat of arms of the city of Manchester was created in 1842, and it's basically a sailing ship to represent Manchester's trade. And in 1842, almost 90% of trade that came by ship to Manchester was cotton. So it's basically a symbol which glorifies the profiteering from slavery. And that symbol is so integral to the city of Manchester that it's in the club crests of both its football clubs, Manchester United and Manchester City. It's there in plain sight, a glorification of the profiteering from slavery on both club badges. That's how embedded slavery is in British society. And that's how we need to, and obviously we've told this story, and the people of Manchester, you know, some of them get very defensive. How dare you say this about us? We went on strike. The cotton mill workers went on strike. But basically, the city of Manchester owes almost everything to slavery, and so we need to be able to tell that story, get that truth out, those facts, that information, and that I think is a way that we can start to change the popular perception of slavery and the continuing legacy, and then to change the government. But I think the government will be almost the last thing to change. I don't think the government will lead, whether it's Labour or Conservative. I think we have to do a lot of groundwork on this.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Rye Henderson, I hope that's how you say your name, from King's. I've read your message 3 times and I hope I've got the gist of it. So I think what you were saying is you were talking about the King's project, and there we can calculate how much was given by the government to quote unquote compensate for the loss of plantations. But they've made a second point, and maybe Priya, hopefully you can maybe help us with this. And it was, we haven't yet factored in the amount that was paid by the laborers when they were trying to access some of this land. So they had to pay for it. Do we have any either figures or ways of calculating? Because I think the economic part of this is very important, because everybody always says, well, how do we know how much to pay? It's so long ago. So I don't know if that was clear. I struggled a little bit myself.
Sure, I'm happy to offer some reflections on that. I mean, I
Thank
do
you.
think that the financial compensation angle and the way that it has kind of engaged in various discussion spaces on reparations is helpful from a public education perspective. It helps to broach the issue in spaces where maybe it's not been discussed before. And I do think that, you know, the more of a kind of multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary approach we can get in kind of calculating what some of those figures are, the better, because if they're coming from a much more robust kind of principle, that's really important. And this goes back to kind of really building in the agency of victimized and affected groups and communities in defining what harm means from their context and from their perspectives. And I think that's so important because we have to ensure that how reparations processes are constructed should reflect a bottom-up approach. Class, race, gender, intersectional concerns should be all really well considered in a consultative framework. And I think that's where we can kind of draw on kind of, you know, what does reparations mean in a way that we can think about it being generative with resources in a way that people can decide. So for me, it's, you know, important to kind of think about those financial aspects, important to think about the ways in which that's being constructed and do that in the widest and most consultative way. But I would definitely say that reparations is more than a compensation approach to thinking about the legacies of slavery and transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And I think that it's important to think about harm in the most widest sense. So at the Abuja Proclamation, Professor Chinweze, African scholar on reparations, talked about self-repair, about psychological damage, about trauma, about all these different facets of how we need to understand the idea of world remaking. And I would really bring this back to the idea of really how subordination between countries works. So, for example, even if we have a nation state paying reparations to a entity of different communities and groups, that is a finite set of resources. Is that going to complete a process of reparations as determined by that community? Or are we still going to be in a system where we're still going to be reproducing the harms that created that inequality in the first place? And I would say that it is the latter, because what we're seeing, you know, so many like scholars and kind of activists have told us, like Walter Rodney, that Africa has experienced extraction of its resources and its wealth, and this has been a systematic underdevelopment that's led to African economies being overly dependent on a small number of raw materials. Now, a lot of my work is kind of looking at mapping what different communities are arguing for and what their contested claims to reparations are, and why there are contestations when it comes to that articulation of harm. Like, why is it so easily dismissed, as we've just discussed in the context of the UK? And what can we draw from in other contexts where there has been progress and there has been positive steps? So, you know, for example, in the case of Belgium, one of the first countries to set up a public inquiry to look at its legacy in context of colonialism. We see the state of California in the US has just written an extensive piece of what reparations means in its context after a very lengthy process of consultation. We see the Banco do Brasil, the Brazil Federal Ministry has just issued an inquiry of the Banco do Brasil, one of Brazil's largest banks, its role in slave trafficking. These are all very significant developments, and I think they point to a much more structural exposition of why we need a kind of reparations approach beyond just the financial, beyond just a kind of approach to kind of determining amount of compensation. Thank you.
Onyekachi, briefly, then we've got a couple of other questions waiting. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on Joe's point about the Labour government and not wanting to move. I mean, you know, what is it Frederick Douglass says that, you know, power resists without a demand. So you have to make the demand, and it's the demand that moves power. In 2001, the demands were there. The African world, this African Atlantic world had got together at the Durban conference and put those issues on the agenda. of the Durban conference, and the momentum was there. So what happened in 1992 to 2001, the momentum was there. The conference was between end of August to September the 8th. And we thought everything was going to move. And then 3 days later, we had the Twin Towers come down and the agenda was lost. And interestingly, the agenda picks up with Black Lives Matter when the retreat from Afghanistan happens. So we spent 20 years fighting wars in caves in Afghanistan, and then the agenda picks up again. So the agenda is not going away, and the demands are being made, because what is, as I said, what is happening now is that Africans are talking. The measure of our freedom is that we're talking about what happened to us. We heard about everybody else. When the compensation schemes were arranged, it was one group of white men talking to each other. And now we want to be in the conversation about compensation. And that's what all this happened. And we're not going to stop talking about this, and the demands will happen. And Joe, it is with the African governments now a question of public diplomacy, this issue. The Ghanaian president will be holding a reparations conference later this year on behalf of the AU. So it's not going away, and it's going to be part of that conversation about the new global order, also the new climate conversations that are going on. Within the climate, these conversations, the principle of damage and loss and reparations have been conceded already. So I think we keep pushing.
Thank you very much. Wanekuchi, you just reminded me of being in Zimbabwe, in Harare, in September 2001, and Thabo Mbeki gave a speech the day after his father died, and he gave the talk about a blues song. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, get back, brother, get back. And I think in a way, this is what part of this conversation has been about. And it links up with the next question that's been asked by Anonymous, which is whether the panel could actually engage with this idea about, is there a continuum of injustice in terms of the way that migrants are spoken of? And by migrants, we mean migrants from the global south as compared to those coming from historically predominantly white countries. And then there's a second question, which I should put to you, and that one's been put forward by Hugh Sharma Waddington. And they say, how can researchers, educators working on global health and development actively support and decolonize, support in the decolonization and reparative justice movement? So what can they do in terms of their work? So that's 2 points. One is about the continuation of migrant treatment, transformative, I suppose, equality type stuff. So I'll be hush. Who wants to go next? Okay. John and then John and then Joseph. Oh, your parents could have given you something that wasn't Jay's. Okay. John, do you want to go first and then Joseph?
Yeah, I didn't raise my hand, but I will say something. I mean, it's interesting, this conversation about what researchers can do. And Onyekachi tells a really good story about the 20 years kind of hiatus when Afghanistan was occupied. But what always seems to me is where we need to start is in education, and that in a way plays to the question about researchers. I mean, to me, if we don't get this story told to school children and to people, I mean, people don't know about this. This is a problem we have, I think. People don't know about transatlantic chattel slavery in any kind of detail. They think it's an anachronism. They think it's old. They think it's the past. You know, I mean, I saw Roots when I was 15, and it blew my mind. I knew nothing about this until I was 15 in Devon. I was in white rural Devon. It's where I grew up. I mean, it's shameful, I think, that this country propagates educationally the notion that we're this fantastic country because we went through the Industrial Revolution and we invested all this knowledge and money and we made this amazing stuff without saying where it came from. We don't talk about extraction and abuse and killing and kidnapping of people over hundreds of years. And unless that is propagated, I don't think we're going to get to what I think is the first stage of reparative journey, which is apology. And I think people are not going to are not going to accept reparations. I'm talking now about the majority of people in this country. I can speak about them, unless they understand why they should apologize. And I think that's where, for me, apology was really important for our family, because I think that's where our journey began. And I think that is really essential if we're going to talk about systematic change.
Joseph, you wanted to speak? Yep, thanks.
Yes, yeah. I can speak to the point about migration, or as I mentioned earlier, about the continuing legacy of slavery, and the way that Black people were depicted during slavery, about, you know, strong but subhuman, low intelligence, lazy. These are the kind of stereotypes that exist to this day. I mean, we've got, you know, stories like the Child Q, horrific story of Child Q only last year. What was that about? But the kind of continuing imagery of Black people that was created during slavery, about, you know, that a child could be brutally strip searched in a school in front of teachers, with the police called in. How could that possibly happen? We see stop and search statistics. We see Black people getting beaten up and shot by the police. So this happens now. It's an ongoing thing. It's not. It didn't just disappear. And if you want, and the question asks about migration. I mean, we only need to look at the, you know, what is a refugee? If a refugee is coming from a white country, then it's open doors. We'll even pay people every month to keep to give them a home. If they're coming from another war-torn part of the world, you know, Syria, Africa, the Middle East, then suddenly the doors are shut and there's no legal routes even to get into the country, and people come in by the only means they have, and they're demonized for it, and having to take these horrific journeys across the water, risk their lives, and they're demonized as if further it's an evidence of their subhumanness, the fact that they're willing to risk their lives like that. I mean, it's the immigration refugee scenario that's played out in the media and in politics is just an absolute confirmation of the continuing legacy and the racial hierarchies that were created during slavery.
Can I just
Thank you very much.
Can I just add to that point on migration? My day job is about looking at diaspora and migration issues. What strikes me about the residences, and again, it goes back to a lot of the points that Priya was making, is just really, you know, at the end of the day, slavery or the trafficking of Africans was about labor, and how African labor is inserted into the global economy. And we saw the attempts that were made to get African labor inserted into the global economy for free and in the most brutal conditions. And today, African labor from the South still has problems being inserted into the global economy. And, you know, we see people now crossing the Sahara, the Mediterranean, to come into the garden, as Joseph Burrell calls it. And so you have a global economy where capital can move, goods, services can move, even intellectual property can move, and labor can't. And Africa actually enjoys, at the moment, a comparative advantage in labor costs. So if Africa wanted to trade, if the global economy was trading fairly, then people should be able to move as part of that global economy. But you can't. So what you're seeing with a lot of this migration is because the economy is not operating functionally, you're seeing Africa exporting dysfunctionally its labor advantages. So every time people say this is an old story, it's not. It's an ongoing story about capital, about goods, services, production, and the role of Africa in all of that. And we can talk about it if we want to, or we can carry on the demonizing and the silence and the silencing of all these issues that we do, or we can have a very frank conversation about what kind of world do we want to, an economic system in that world do we want to create, and that, I think, goes to some of the points that Priya has been making.
Okay. Brilliant. You're doing really well, and we've got a couple of other questions that we've got queued up. The first one is from Tajendra Firali, who says, can the panel reflect on the UK's approach to international development and the relevance of the reparative justice movement? So that was one. Can the panel reflect on the UK's approach to international development and the relevance of the reparative justice movement? And the second one was a comment from Tim Malcolmson, which was about reinforcing, I think, Priya and all the people who've spoken, the importance of education. And he wondered about moving beyond money to also be clearer with what is being repaired and restored, how and by whom. So education is important, moving beyond just an engagement with money to be clearer about what is being repaired and restored, how and by whom. What, how, and by whom. Anybody wants it again? No?
I can
Okay.
jump in on the international
Brilliant.
development aspect. I mean, I think we've known for a long time that approaches to aid are putting a plaster on problems in the context of global South countries and their communities and their peoples. So when we think about reparations, I think it's a much more meaningful and permanent kind of way of kind of rethinking, like, why are we kind of envisaging like just the most minimalist and the most survivalist kind of approach to communities? In effect, what we're seeing in a lot of the development policies that we've seen coming out of, many Western nations, many Western contexts, is a kind of othering, an othering of communities, a kind of agreement that, a kind of aid and a kind of very minimalist kind of inclusion onto global supply chains will be the kind of pathway towards some kind of existence for global South communities. So that in itself like really stems from what we see as like what has been the way in which communities in different countries across the world that were formerly colonized were also described in kind of the origins of development policy. You see things from the British Colonial Office, for example, which describe populations in Africa as ill-equipped to make decisions about their own future. And that's where like the ideology of development comes from, the kind of concept of it, that there are countries where there are rich cultures, self-determination, ways of existing indigenous cultures, ways of harnessing and respecting the environment, but yet they are considered underdeveloped. But actually structurally as well, the things that the kind of government and the development policies coming out of these kind of Western settings have led to is a kind of continuation of financial subordination. So we see these approaches which have been ahistorical. They have erased political analysis from their approaches. And then they have put a kind of one-size-fits-all kind of approach to how you see development policies turning up in one country and then being imported into another setting. But I would really argue that in this setting, the three areas that are kind of most detrimental, and the areas that perhaps, organizations or outfits in the UK that are looking to get behind solidarity to support reparative actions. First of all, that would start with the things that Onyekachi is saying, supporting movements out there, supporting like the APGAR, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations. And as Onyekachi said, the conference is happening in 2 weeks' time in October, and we can send on details to panelists here today. But I think the other thing is to really look at debt, trade and tax, and look at where campaigners are calling for re-envisioning, and particularly decolonial ways of re-envisioning the policies that continue to bind in these three areas. So we're seeing, for example, illicit financial flow structures where UK regulation is kind of, completely complicit in enabling some of these structures where profit is allowed to escape before tax is paid on it in so many least developed countries. The nature of debt arrangements between so many Western nations and so many least developed countries, lots of calls to cancel debt during the pandemic. But if we look at the political economy of why countries are faced with such limited options when they come into financial instability, that really unpacks how imperialism continues. And then looking lastly, really at the funds that are being made available for climate change, like how this is again really reflected an othering of kind of the experience of climate change. And only I think more recently in the last summer's kind of experience of climate change in Western settings as well, have we seen a more kind of recognition and a bit more of a humility that this is affecting us all, but actually the proportions in which these issues affect different countries really expose the glaring inequalities. So I would say that development policy is really, really an important area to look at for both a decolonial aspect, but also kind of really supporting what holistic reparations means, like really thinking about these concepts of non-repetition, of restitution, of rehabilitation, and thinking about kind of why development is kind of, you know, perhaps not really approach that's appropriate for the gravity of the problems that we see across the world today.
Farida, you are on mute.
Apologies. Thank you, Priya. That was wonderful. There was a second question, I think, in terms of moving beyond what is to be repaired and restored. And since we've had another question come in from actually my colleague, Dr. Lucia Kula, who was saying in terms of access to education, what is being done through access to scholarships and opportunities. I think possibly Joseph has had to leave for another meeting. So we have Tim Malcolmson's questions about moving beyond money. And then we've also got what is being done in terms of education and opportunities.
I could probably say something about education side. When we first talked to the Grenadian authorities, it became clear that education felt as though both that was very important to the authorities, particularly because we were talking to the University of the West Indies. So we've been putting money into, as the Trevelian family, into the Open Campus project, but also a schools project called Grenade, but which helps rural children to get to school and pays for things like school books and the kind of things that are stopping children being able to go to school. And we went in and talked to some school children in Grenada, and we sat in a room with some really smart 15, 16-year-old boys, and we were kind of challenged quite a lot by them, which was really good. It was a very powerful session. And one of the things that really stuck with me was one of them said, well, look, it's great that you're giving money for education and sort of for opportunity, but that's for the future. But what about my elderly grandmother who's disabled and lives in the country and has got nothing? You know, what are you doing for her? What's reparatory justice doing for people who are suffering from terrible medical conditions, a lot of which is as a legacy of slavery? You know, hypertension. We know that diabetes is pretty prevalent in the Caribbean due to poor diet, which again has been inherited from what people ate in the past, and it's very thought-provoking. The other thing that really provokes you, and this goes back to Priya's point about the global climate crisis, is that in 2004 Grenada suffered a terrible hurricane which ripped off 90% of the roofs, and since then there still isn't a functioning national library. The museum has been closed for years. There are very, very few educational institutions, you know, such as the kind of things that we're used to in the West, and in some ways you look at a country like that, an island like that, and you think, well, it's only one hurricane away from another catastrophe. And so the reality of the help needed and the support and the infrastructural change required is huge, and you know, education is only a part of that.
Thank you very much. Our panel is one of our panelists has had to go, so you'll see that Joseph has fallen off, and so he had another meeting, which is a pity because I think, Simi, you had a question about the Guardian and going beyond othering. So I think Priya mentioned the othering of people. And so I think the point that you were picking up on is how we move beyond the way that Black bodies especially are spoken about. But hopefully we touched a little bit about that when we did, when Joseph spoke, I thought very powerfully about migration and the perception of migrants from the global south. So I'm going to hand over to Shireen. So I don't know at this point if I get to say thank you first. And I'd like that very much. Shireen, who's going to speak last, is the person who has brought us all together and has made this possible. And she is the best of organizers, absolutely encouraging, and she's absolutely fantastic. So thank you ever so much. This wouldn't have happened without you. We're so grateful. Thank you, obviously, to the panelists, Priya, Dr. Priya Luka, Joseph, who's now gone, Joseph Harker from The Guardian, Onyekachi Wamba, and we can always find these people. We know where to find them because their details are all linked up, including their X accounts, or apparently used to be called Twitter. And finally, John Dower. Thank you also to Dinesh and to Natalia and to you for coming, and appreciated, really. So, Shireen, the wonderful, over to you.
Thank you very much. And, you know, so truly humbled by what I've heard today, and very grateful to have a job that, you know, enables me to be part of these events. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today. I know for many of us, these issues are personal. I'm very conscious of the fact that today is World Mental Health Day. And here in Britain, we know what the differences are between how Black people and people of colour experience mental health and mental health care, and how white people experience it, and that's reflected throughout the world. So I'm hugely conscious of that. Before we go, just a couple of short points. I mentioned in the chat earlier that if you are in an LIDC member organisation and you want us to feature your work, reach out to us. That would be nice. We love to hear about what our members are doing around the world, and not just in England. And we also like to be able to bring people together to share expertise, as you've seen here. We have a short course on evaluation, and we're very proud of our short course. It runs in a hybrid format. This year's course runs from December 11th to 15th. You can attend either in person or online, which is what hybrid means. And we have a session for people who are interested in knowing more about the course, what it entails, what it involves. And we will be holding that on the 24th of October. So look out for information about that. We will have the course co-director, Dr. Hugh Sharma Waddington, with us. So if you have any questions about that, then do please look out for news about that from today onwards. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank my boss. Really, you know, I'm staring down the barrel of the retirement gun right now, so I'm not after promotion. I can genuinely say that it does help to love what you do. It really does. And these issues, as you know, Claire, are very personal to me as well. So I'm glad that I have this chance to explore that. Dinesh, Natalia, the solidarity, you know, the work that you've done to keep me going through what has been a very intense period through freshers and what have you. But everyone, thank you so much. Connect with us on Twitter. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn as well. Tell your friends about us, join LIDC, read the articles, the books that we've posted about in the chat. We look forward to seeing you all again. We will be uploading the recording of today's event. We need you on board if we're going to make change. You know, back in the days of apartheid, we used to sing a song about Nzima Lumthwalo. You'll remember that, Farida, whose mother lives just down the road from where I used to live in Harare. Small world. But yes, it's a long struggle. We can only affect change if we do it together. So thank you for joining us today. Be part of the change, and thank you for allowing me, the opportunity to do the same. So goodbye. We will see you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You.
Thanks, Al.